Community college. That's what Dr. Hayes called her, voice pitched just loud enough for the surgical staff to hear. Megan O'Brien didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She continued organizing the trauma bay's instrument trays, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory nobody at Mercy General would ever understand. Hayes stood in the doorway with a patient chart, his tailored white coat catching the fluorescent glare. Community college here can handle the post-ops, he announced to the ICU nurses clustered at the station behind him. I'm sure her training covers that much. The word training landed with a particular emphasis, as if it were something he'd picked from the bottom of his shoe. Laughter. Soft at first, then bolder. The night shift staff didn't know these hands had sutured severed arteries in a bombed-out field hospital outside Sanjin. They didn't know the calm in her eyes came from holding intestines inside men while Taliban mortars punched holes through corrugated metal walls. They didn't know she'd spent 16 consecutive hours under sustained fire, keeping 7 soldiers alive on nothing but 4 bags, tourniquets, and the kind of focus that only comes when you understand that one mistake means someone's mother gets a folded flag. She set down the surgical clamps. Not hard. Not angry. Just placed them against stainless steel with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than Hayes's condescension. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation issue from Mercy General Supply, but underneath them sat a leather field journal in her pocket, the spine cracked from 3 years of use. Pressed desert flowers marked certain pages, Creeping Daisy, believed to be from somewhere near FOB Shankin Loga province, though the label she'd written was vague for a reason. The flowers weren't sentimental. They were bookmarks. The pages they marked contained 17 pages of handwritten notes documenting fentanyl shipment serial numbers, dispensary entries that didn't match incoming inventory, and a pattern that had started forming exactly 4 weeks ago. She closed her eyes for just a moment. 1 measured breath in. 1 measured breath out. When she opened them again, her face was blank as a surgical field. Hayes was already walking away, satisfied with the laugh he'd bought. He always was. 3 days ago at shift change, he'd used the nickname again. Community college, could you restock the crash carts? 2 days before that, he'd interrupted her during a patient assessment. Let's make sure community college doesn't miss anything obvious, shall we? Each deployment of the name was casual, almost affectionate in its cruelty. A game played in the presence of witnesses. She understood the architecture of what he was doing, understood it the way someone understands the architecture of an IED before it detonates. Social dominance established through incremental humiliation. Make her small. Make her visible. Make her the staff joke. But she also understood that none of them had any idea who they were working beside. Mercy General's trauma bay hummed with the particular silence of a hospital on the night shift. The ventilator in Bay 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, and somewhere down the corridor, a patient's call light blinked with patient insistence. Fluorescent strips overhead created that hospital-specific glow that made everyone look slightly cadaverous. Megan moved through it like a ghost, efficient and unnoticed, which was exactly how she needed to operate. She'd been at Mercy General for 6 weeks, cycling through different floor assignments, ostensibly as a new trauma nurse finding her footing in a civilian hospital system. That was the cover story. The truth was more complicated, and it lived in a locked safe in her apartment on Riverside Avenue, about 4 miles from here. An NCIS credentials badge. A classified briefing folder marked Pharma Diversion Southeast Task Force. A cell phone with a direct line to Naval Criminal Investigative Service that she'd been instructed to use only in extreme circumstances. Her real assignment had nothing to do with Mercy General's patients and everything to do with the missing medication. The fentanyl discrepancies had started appearing in late September. Shipments of pharmaceutical-grade fentanyl arriving at Mercy General's pharmacy, logged and documented, the paperwork pristine and properly filled out. Bottles checked in by the night pharmacist, Marcus Chen. Containers stored in the locked ICU medication cabinet. But the quantities that emerged in patient records never quite matched the quantities that entered the system. 20 bottles arrived. Patient records showed 14 bottles dispensed. Sometimes the variance was smaller, 2%, 3%. Easy to attribute to documentation error, to rounding, to normal hospital inefficiency. But Megan had spent the last 6 weeks learning the rhythms of Mercy General's supply chain, and she knew inefficiency didn't move in patterns. Inefficiency was chaotic. This was organized, deliberate, systematic. She'd started accessing the ICU records room at odd hours during her shifts, pulling the medication logs and comparing them against the pharmacy intake manifests. Cross-referencing serial numbers. The locked cabinet where the fentanyl was stored sat directly across from the records room's small window. Through that window, she could see the cabinet during the day shift change around 6 a.m. She'd noticed that Dr. Hayes sometimes had keys to that cabinet. She'd noticed that certain batches of medication disappeared on nights when Hayes was working. She'd also noticed that Mercy General had 3 board members, and 2 of them, Richard Sterling and an administrator named Conrad Bancroft, frequently met with Hayes in the back offices after late rounds. She documented the dates, the times, the patterns. Her field journal, the one with the pressed desert flowers, contained 16 pages of observations written in a code of her own design. Medical terminology interspersed with botanical notations. To anyone else, it would look like a nurse's personal study guide. To NCIS, it would be invaluable intelligence. But 3 days ago, Dr. Hayes had caught her lingering near the ICU records room door. She'd been pulling a specific shipment manifest from August, cross-referencing it against a dispensary log that didn't quite add up. Hayes had appeared in the corridor without warning, his movement so silent that she only realized he was there when his shadow fell across the file cabinet. "Working late," he'd said. Not a question. A statement delivered in that pleasant voice he used when he was uncomfortable. Trying to understand our inventory systems, she'd replied, her tone carefully deferential. New to civilian hospitals. He'd studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he'd smiled. The smile was the problem. It wasn't a real smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just recognized a threat he hadn't anticipated. That smile meant he knew. Maybe not everything. But enough. Enough to understand that she'd noticed something, that her questions about medication discrepancies had been more than casual curiosity. Enough to understand that she represented a risk to whatever operation he was running in the shadows of Mercy General's pharmacy system. The next morning, the shift assignments had changed. She'd been moved from day shift back to nights, but now she was rotating through the medical floors instead of staying anchored in the trauma bay. Monday night she worked orthopedics. Tuesday night, cardiology. Wednesday night, a float assignment that left her covering whatever floor was short-staffed. The medical floors didn't have access to the ICU medication cabinet. The shifts were staggered in ways that prevented pattern recognition, that made it impossible to observe the same time windows repeatedly. She understood what Hayes was doing. Isolate her. Restrict her access. Rotate her through assignments so fragmented that she couldn't build a coherent picture of the operation. She accepted each shift change with a quiet "of course, Dr. Hayes," each restriction with a nod of understanding. Her composure didn't crack. Her voice remained measured. When he reassigned her to cover an overflow unit on the south wing, she said, "Thank you for the opportunity." When he moved her name off the trauma bay rotation, she simply noted the change and adjusted her schedule. But internally, her mind was running calculations. The timing of the shift changes. The specific assignments he'd chosen. The floors he'd specifically excluded her from. Each restriction was a brick in a wall, and the wall was telling her something crucial. Dr. Hayes didn't want her near the pharmacy. Didn't want her comparing notes across similar time windows. Didn't want her building the kind of comprehensive picture that would expose the full scope of what he was doing. She understood that this was stage 2 of his strategy. Stage 1 had been social, the nickname, the public mockery, the subtle undermining of her credibility in front of the surgical staff. Just establishing the narrative, as her NCIS handler had warned during her pre-assignment briefing. Sometimes they try to make the person who's investigating them look unreliable before the real threat materializes. Stage 2 was institutional. Use the system against her. Use the hospital's own structure to isolate and contain her. It was competent work, which meant Hayes wasn't just some careless administrator skimming pills. He was someone who understood how to manage threats within hierarchical systems. Someone who'd thought this through. But he didn't know who he was isolating. He didn't know that the hands reshelving the medication bottles in the orthopedics unit had once held a field hospital together through a firefight that lasted most of the night. He didn't know that her composure, the measured breaths, the blank expression, the absence of visible anger, came from years of practicing a discipline so deep it had become almost invisible. He didn't know that she'd already documented 12 separate medication discrepancies with serial number confirmations, or that she'd photographed 3 manifests with her personal phone, images that were already backed up on a secure NCIS server. He didn't know that the little leather journal in her scrub pocket was one of the most important pieces of evidence in a federal pharmaceutical diversion investigation spanning 3 VA hospitals and at least $47,000 in missing medication. He only knew that she'd asked questions, and questions were dangerous. On her 7th night working the orthopedics floor, Megan was charting vital signs on a post-surgical patient when her shift supervisor, a nurse named Patricia, appeared at the station with a message from Dr. Hayes. New assignment effective immediately. She'd been pulled from the rotation entirely, moved to a satellite clinic location at Mercy General's South Beach branch, a facility 23 miles from downtown Jacksonville where the census was lighter and the patient acuity significantly lower. The message was delivered in Patricia's apologetic voice, the tone people use when they're relaying news they don't quite understand themselves. He said you'd be a better fit for a smaller environment, Patricia said, clearly uncomfortable with the words coming out of her mouth. Thinks you'd benefit from working in a less complex setting. Megan simply nodded, said thank you, and continued her charting without missing a single vital sign entry. Her hand didn't tremble. Her jaw didn't clench. She took one measured breath, and then another, and filed the new information away in the same part of her mind where she kept everything else, the medication discrepancies, the pattern of Hayes's behavior, the systematic architecture of his attempt to contain her. She was being pushed further away. Further isolated. And that meant she was getting closer to something he desperately wanted hidden. The last assignment change came 5 days later. Hayes approached her at the records room door, the same location where he'd first realized she was looking too carefully at the numbers. This time he was alone. This time his voice was almost cordial, the way people sound when they're about to deliver bad news they've decided to couch in politeness. Megan, let's talk about your floor assignments, he said, his hand already reaching to close the records room door behind her. The conference room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. 20 physicians and nurses filled the tiered rows, their attention fixed on the screen where Dr. Hayes had projected Megan's chart notes in 20-point font. She stood in the back, spine straight, hands folded. Waiting. Here we see an example of incomplete assessment documentation, Hayes began, his laser pointer circling her handwriting like a surgeon marking an incision line. Notice the civilian nursing shorthand. Acceptable perhaps in community settings. Below our standards here. He turned a full degree, finding her eyes across the room. These gaps in documentation could cost us accreditation. Could cost patients their lives. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. No one moved. Community college, he said, the nickname landing like a blade. Would you explain your rationale here? Every head turned. 20 faces. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath a sniper takes before the trigger press. Those notes documented a successful trauma stabilization, Megan said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. The patient lived. Hayes smiled. Not warmth. The kind of smile a wolf makes showing its teeth. Survival isn't the only metric of quality care, is it? Documentation standards exist for a reason. Institutional memory. Legal protection. Credibility. He advanced the slide. Her name. Her credentials. Her school. Tell me, how many hours of advanced pharmacology did your program require? 80, she answered. Our residents here completed 400. He looked at the surgeons flanking him. They shifted. Uncomfortable. 400 hours. There's a reason we maintain those standards. Megan didn't flinch. Didn't blink. The tear that escaped her left eye wasn't fear. It was restraint. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the sound a steel cable makes when you wind it too tight. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her hand moving once, precise. Hayes waited for her to break. For an apology. For the shame to crack her composure. Instead, she spoke 5 words into the silence. I've held intestines inside men with better character than you'll ever have. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of discomfort. The silence that comes when someone has said something true and everyone feels it resonate through their bones. Hayes' face flooded red. His jaw worked soundlessly. Megan turned and walked from the conference room, her footsteps echoing on the tile like a countdown. 3 days later, she stood at the 3rd-floor vending machine during a rare break. 6 minutes of solitude, if she was lucky. The machine hummed its electric drone. She selected black coffee, no sugar. Fuel, not comfort. Hayes arrived with 2 surgical residents flanking him like remoras on a shark. His timing wasn't coincidental. Nothing he did was. He'd learned her break schedule. Waited for the moment when enough staff lingered nearby but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. Gentlemen, serious question, he announced, feeding coins into the adjacent machine with theatrical precision. Do you think community college nursing programs adequately prepare graduates for level 1 trauma work? He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. The nurses at the nearby station had gone very still. Every year pivoting. I mean, for years at a proper university versus, what? 18 months and some clinical rotations. He retrieved his soda with deliberate slowness. The residents laughed nervously, the sound of subordinates performing compliance. Megan's hand moved to her coffee. Steady. Not trembling. Not burning red. Just a nurse in scrubs reaching for caffeine in a hallway at Mercy General. Her badge caught the fluorescent light, a small rectangle of institutional identity that meant nothing about who she actually was. A single tear escaped her left eye again. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Hayes. Without breaking her composure. The eye contact itself was the weapon. The calm itself was the answer. I've held intestines inside men with better character than you'll ever have, she said, the words landing softer this time. Quieter. More lethal for it. She walked past him. Past the residents. Past the nurses who suddenly became very interested in their computers. Her gait was unchanged. Her breathing unchanged. The only thing that changed was how every person in that hallway would remember her for the rest of their lives. But that wasn't the worst part. 1 week later, Megan accessed the restricted medication log using credentials that shouldn't exist in any official hospital system. NCIS had provided them authorization codes that would penetrate Mercy General's pharmaceutical database without triggering standard audit flags. She was photographing serial numbers, cross-referencing them against her encrypted field journal where pressed desert flowers marked the pages of her investigation. Fentanyl. Shipments documented as delivered but not dispersed. The trail led directly to Hayes and the 2 board members he consulted with during lunch. Kellerman and Price. Both names appeared in a pharmaceutical diversion scheme that stretched across for VA hospitals in the Southeast. She saved the file to her encrypted drive when Hayes arrived with 2 security guards flanking him like dogs on a leash. The guards' radios crackled with static. Their hand movements were constrained, careful. Hayes had briefed them well. That's a fireable offense, he said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. Not the rage of passion. The rage of someone who'd lost control of a situation and was compensating with institutional power. His hand gestured at the terminal. Access to that log requires administrator credentials. Which you don't have. Megan saved the file. Her movements didn't accelerate. Didn't slow. Medically precise. I could have you escorted out right now, Hayes continued, stepping closer. Close enough that she could smell the cologne masking his sweat. Close enough that she could see the vein pulsing at his temple. Charges filed. Your license reviewed. Your school contacted. One phone call and every program director you listed as a reference gets asked very specific questions about your actual competency. She turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of a North Atlantic in winter. Those logs show missing fentanyl shipments. He laughed. Actually laughed. You think you've discovered something? You think you're going to what? Report me? His voice dropped to a whisper meant for her alone. I've been doing this for 7 years, Megan. 7 years. I have board members, hospital administrators, and a pharmaceutical ethics investigator who owes me his career. One more step out of line and you don't just lose your nursing license. You lose your credibility. Your future. Everything. He left before she could respond. The guards remained, watching as she gathered her things. Watching as she walked past them with her badge and her scrubs and her field journal tucked beneath her arm like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Hayes was already making calls. First to Kellerman, the board member whose Mercedes was financed by pharmaceutical distributions that never got entered into official records. Then to Price, the supply chain director whose daughter's medical school tuition came from accounts that existed only on paper. Then to Marcus Webb, the external medical ethics investigator who'd built his consulting practice on doing exactly this kind of work, establishing termination cases for hospital administrators who needed problems removed quietly. He contacted the director of nursing at Megan's credentialing school, asking careful questions about her advanced clinical hours, her actual trauma experience, whether she'd truly completed her rotations or if she'd received any accommodations. Planting seeds. Establishing doubt. Creating a paper trail of legitimate institutional concern that would precede any formal investigation. The hospital's machinery was beginning to move. Not visibly. Not yet. But like a massive vessel shifting in water, the current was changing direction, and Megan O'Brien was in the path. She spent that night in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, the one behind the automated medication dispensers where security cameras had a blind spot. Her field journal lay open on her lap, the leather worn soft from 8 years of service. She photographed each medication serial number into the encrypted cloud, building a timeline. The pressed desert flowers remained pressed between the pages, poppies from Sanjin, collected during a 16-hour field operation in 2009 when she'd maintained a forward surgical site under sustained Taliban assault and Hayes was still sleeping in his Jacksonville mansion. Pain was information. Scars told stories. And field journals preserved evidence that institutions preferred to forget. The call came at 2:47 a.m. Military training accident. Catastrophic internal bleeding. ETA for minutes. Megan was in the trauma bay when the doors exploded open and Sergeant Major Kenneth Reeves arrived on a stretcher, his desert fatigue soaked the color of rust. His face was the gray-white of blood loss measured in milliliters. His eyes were open but already receding into shock. 52-year-old male, penetrating abdominal trauma, equipment malfunction during transport training, the paramedic called out, moving with the controlled precision of someone who'd done this before. BP 70/40 and dropping. 2 units en route. We've got massive hemorrhage, likely splenic laceration with retroperitoneal extension. Megan moved. Her hands found for access before Hayes was even paged. 18-gauge catheter, left antecubital fossa. 1 unit type O uncrossed, running wide open. Her eyes tracked Reeves's pupils, his chest rise, the monitors that were already screaming his body's distress in beeps and alarms and the hiss of oxygen flowing. Cross 8 units minimum, she said to the nurse beside her. He'll need massive transfusion protocol. I didn't call for that yet, Hayes snapped, appearing at the trauma bay entrance like he'd materialized from the walls themselves. Who authorized? Blood loss at this rate is approximately 90 milliliters per minute, Megan said, not looking up from Reeves's abdomen. 8 units minimum. I'm saving time. Hayes took command. Started barking orders with the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. But his eyes kept returning to her hands. To the way she moved like someone who'd done this not in simulation labs but in actual combat. The way her movements predicted what he was about to call for. The way her confidence filled the space like water finding its level. In surgery prep, Rodriguez, a former army medic now working as a surgical assistant, watched as Megan clamped a bleeder using a 3-layer technique. Proximal isolation to prevent backflow. Lateral compression to stop the bleeding source. Distal verification to ensure collateral circulation remained intact. It was a textbook maneuver, but the execution was poetry. The kind of poetry that only comes from doing it under fire. Rodriguez froze. His hands went still mid-motion. That clamp pattern, he whispered, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. That's the Helm and Valley technique. The one from the journal articles. He looked at her face. Really looked at it. Beneath the fluorescent lights, beneath the surgical mask, beneath 18 months of careful invisibility. You're that Marine from Sanjin. Megan's hands didn't stop moving. Her jaw tightened. Just that. Just the smallest acknowledgement that he'd seen something true. What Marine? Hayes demanded from across the room. Nothing, sir, Rodriguez recovered quickly, professional instinct overriding curiosity. Just recognized a technique. But Hayes was watching now. Suspicious. His institutional certainty beginning to crack at the edges. During the procedure, Reeves began deteriorating. His pressure dropped to 60/30 despite the blood, despite the fluids running wide open. Hayes called for more units. More antibiotics. But the real problem was building in Reeves's chest cavity, air accumulating between the visceral pleura and parietal pleura, collapsing his lung, creating a tension pneumothorax that no amount of abdominal surgery would fix. We need to decompress now, Megan said. We address the primary injury first, Hayes responded, focused on the abdominal bleeding. He'll code in 90 seconds. Doctor, he needs. I know what he needs. Hayes roared, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. Pure power with nowhere to go. Reeves's monitor alarmed. The oxygen saturation numbers plummeted like a stone thrown into deep water. 80. 70. 60. The rate of decline was exponential. Critical. Megan's hand moved toward the personal effects bag on the trauma bay side table. Toward the MRE ration Sergeant Major Reeves still carried from his deployment. Standard issue. Marine culture. A habit that had saved his life before. It was about to save it again. The ambulance doors burst open at 2:47 a.m. Sergeant Major Kenneth Reeves was already coded yellow before the paramedics wheeled him through Mercy General's trauma bay, catastrophic internal bleeding from a training accident, the kind that didn't leave much margin for error. His abdomen was distended, purple-black bruising spreading like a stain across his lower ribs. The paramedic riding beside the stretcher gave the handoff in rapid clipped sentences. Motor vehicle collision during night maneuvers. Blunt force trauma to the left side. Estimated blood loss already 2 liters. He's been crashing since we picked him up. The surgical team assembled like they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, because they had. Mercy General's Level 1 Trauma Center didn't stay ranked without precision. Dr. Hayes was already scrubbed in, already calling for units of O-negative blood, already moving with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was the smartest person in every room. Megan stood at the edge of the trauma bay, watching Reeves disappear into surgery. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours. Her scrub still carried the smell of the previous shift, bleach and exhaustion and the copper undertone of other people's crises. She'd been filling out discharge paperwork when the trauma alert came through the overhead system. Every muscle in her body had gone rigid. She'd learned to read names in a police scanner's static. But Reeves was a common enough surname. 10 seconds of logic told her the odds were slim. 3 seconds of instinct told her she was wrong. She moved toward the surgical observation window anyway, drawn by something she couldn't have explained to anyone who asked. Hayes was making the first incision, his hands moving with the fluid precision of a maestro conducting an orchestra that could kill you if he miscounted a beat. The belly was as bad as the paramedics had warned. Lacerated spleen. Fractured pelvis. Bleeding from at least 2 arterial sources. Hayes was already clamping vessels, calling for more blood, his voice steady as a cardiac monitor in normal sinus rhythm. Then the senior surgical resident, a former Army medic named Rodriguez, leaned closer to the operative field. Rodriguez had been stationed in San Juan for 2 tours. He'd seen field surgery done with whatever was available. He'd learned to recognize signature techniques the way a musician recognizes a composer's work. And there, in the way Hayes was setting up the arterial repair, was something Rodriguez had never seen executed in an operating room before. A 3-layer arterial clamp configuration. Hayes wasn't doing it, he was setting up the instruments for someone else to execute it. The kind of setup that only made sense if you'd done it 100 times under fire with nothing but your hands and whatever medical supplies hadn't been destroyed by insurgent fire. Rodriguez's eyes flicked toward the observation window. Toward Megan. He leaned in close to the surgical nurse next to him. Spoke low enough that only she could hear. "You're that Marine from the Helmand Valley." It wasn't a question. Rodriguez was looking at Hayes, who was already beginning to realize that something had shifted in the room. That recognition was spreading through the surgical team like a current. Megan didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge. She'd spent 6 years learning to disappear into hospital corridors. 6 years teaching herself how to be invisible in a way that had nothing to do with skin or height or voice. But Rodriguez's words had changed the calculation. Hayes turned. His hands were still inside Reeves's abdomen. His eyes were still on the work. But his entire body language had shifted into something predatory. "O'Brien," he said flatly. It was the first time he'd called her by her real name in weeks. Step back from the observation window. She didn't step back. She moved toward the surgical suite instead. Pushed through the doors into the controlled chaos of trauma. Hayes's expression changed. Surprise first. Then something uglier. "What are you doing in my OR?" But he already knew what she was doing. He was watching her move toward the crash cart with the economy of motion that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license. He was watching her take in the field, the amount of bleeding, the arterial damage, the precarious balance between hemorrhagic shock and whatever intervention could stop it. She was assessing. The way a surgeon assesses. The way someone with authority assesses. Reeves began to deteriorate as Megan moved through the surgical suite. His oxygen saturation plummeting. The monitor above his head screaming a rhythm that was fracturing into tachycardia, the heart compensating for blood volume it couldn't replace fast enough. But the real danger came in the form of a sound, a whistle of air escaping where air shouldn't be. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pushing against his heart. The body's equivalent of a house of cards falling in slow motion. Hayes was still working the abdominal bleeds. Didn't hear it. Didn't see it. Or saw it and made a calculation that the abdominal wound was the priority. But the pneumothorax would kill Reeves faster than the bleeding. Megan didn't ask permission. She moved to the edge of the stretcher where Reeves's belongings sat in a clear plastic bag. Found what she was looking for. An MRE pouch, meal ready to eat, the one item that made sense in a trauma bay because it contained exactly what she needed. She tore it open with her teeth. The vacuum seal broke with a sound like a gunshot, sudden and sharp. "What are you doing?" A surgical nurse, young, terrified, trained to follow protocol, grabbed at her arm. "Saving his life," Megan said. It was the first time she'd spoken in the surgical suite. Her voice had changed. Dropped an octave. Carried the kind of absolute certainty that came from having already saved lives in worse circumstances than this. She fashioned the chest seal in 15 seconds. Took the plastic wrapper and the medical tape from the wall dispenser and created a 3-sided seal over Reeves's right chest, sterile enough for field conditions, airtight enough to relieve the pressure. The same way she'd done it 43 times in Sanjin. The same way she'd done it for Lance Corporal Morrison in March 2019, and Corporal Chen in July 2020, and for a Taliban fighter she'd treated in a firefight because gunnery sergeants didn't get to pick which lives they saved. "O'Brien, step back!" Hayes was shouting now. Finally seeing her. Finally understanding what was happening. But she was already moving toward the crash cart. Finding the 14-gauge needle. Identifying the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that lived in her hands the way other people carried memories. She didn't hesitate. Didn't consider the consequences. The needle went in and there was that unmistakable sound. The hiss of air escaping. Tension releasing. Physics and biology realigning themselves. Reeves's oxygen saturation began to climb. 68. 72. 81. His blood pressure stabilized. The monitor stopped screaming. Rodriguez stared at her. Complete recognition now. He'd just watched someone perform an emergency decompression that wasn't in any civilian textbook. That belonged in a field hospital under fire. That belonged in the hands of someone who had already survived the worst that medicine and combat could inflict simultaneously. Hayes was staring at her too. But his expression was different. He saw an unauthorized procedure. Saw protocol violations. Saw improvised equipment being used in his sterile OR. Saw something far more dangerous than any of those things. He saw Rodriguez looking at Megan like she was someone important. Someone with a history that existed before this hospital. Someone he didn't control. "Everyone out except essential surgical staff," Hayes ordered. His voice had changed too. Harder now. Colder. "O'Brien, you're done here." The words were a dismissal, but they were also the opening move in a calculated response. Megan stripped off her surgical gloves as she walked toward the door. Didn't look back. Knew exactly what was about to happen because she'd seen it before. She'd seen institutional power mobilize. She'd seen it in forward operating bases when officers decided someone knew too much. She'd seen it in emergency rooms when someone stepped out of line. Hayes was already in the hallway with his phone before the OR doors finished closing. She could hear his voice, low, urgent, the cadence of someone making calls that mattered. He was reaching out to board member Kellerman first. Then Price. Activating the network he'd built. The conspiracy of convenience between hospital administrators and pharmaceutical suppliers. By the time Megan reached the locker room, Hayes had pivoted the narrative entirely. He called Marcus Webb, the ethics investigator he'd worked with before on the difficult personnel matters. Webb was already drafting the termination report in his head. Unauthorized procedures. Exceeding scope of practice. Potential patient endangerment despite positive outcome. The language of institutional betrayal. Hayes picked up the phone again. Dialed Dr. Sharon Vickers at Megan's nursing school in Jacksonville. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes. Hayes's voice was measured. Concerned. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we've discovered some significant gaps in her clinical competency here at Mercy General. I was wondering if you might review her rotation evaluations from her time with you. We may have missed some red flags about her ability to work within institutional frameworks." By the time that call ended, doubt had been planted. The kind of doubt that would follow her, that would make future employers hesitate, that would reframe her entire 6-year nursing history as potential liability rather than expertise. Within 40 minutes, Hayes had constructed a fortress. Kellerman and Price were on standby. Webb was polishing his investigator credentials. The nursing school had flagged her file for review. When Megan emerged from the locker room in her civilian clothes, still carrying the smell of the trauma bay on her skin, Hayes was waiting with hospital security and HR Director Pamela Cross. His timing was impeccable. His delivery was rehearsed. He used her full name like a weapon. "Gunnery Sergeant Megan O'Brien, you're terminated effective immediately for gross violation of protocol, exceeding your scope of practice as a registered nurse, and performing unauthorized procedures that endangered patient safety. Security will escort you from the premises. You'll surrender your ID badge and hospital parking pass. We'll mail your final paycheck. Megan reached up and removed her ID badge. The motion was careful, deliberate. 6 years of cover disintegrating in the space of 10 seconds. She couldn't defend herself. Couldn't explain that every decision she'd made in that surgical suite had been calculated to save a life. Couldn't reveal that the entire reason she'd stayed at Mercy General was to track pharmaceutical discrepancies connected to a multi-state opioid theft operation that supplied black markets within a 50-mile radius of military bases. Revealing any of that would compromise the NCIS investigation. Would burn sources. Would shut down a pipeline that was still being mapped. So she surrendered her badge and said nothing. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. But something inside her had fractured in a way that even Sanjin hadn't managed to break. The basement of Mercy General smelled like bleach and industrial detergent, a sharp chemical burn that cut through the humidity rising from the washers. Megan descended the stairs at 2:47 in the morning, the same timestamp Sergeant Major Reeves had arrived 6 hours earlier, though she didn't know that yet. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in the color of dead skin. Her scrubs were folded into 3 precise bundles, still warm from the commercial dryers, the fabric carrying the faint medicinal scent of hospital-grade fabric softener. The folding table was stainless steel, cold enough to shock her palms as she set the first bundle down. Around her, the machines rumbled in their mechanical rhythm, washers spinning their final cycles, extracting water from clothes that would never dry on her body again. She smoothed the fabric flat. Crisp corners. The same technique she'd learned in boot camp, the same precision she'd used on dress blues during inspection, the same discipline that had kept her alive through 17 months in Helmand Province. Her fingers moved with muscle memory that belonged to a different woman wearing a different uniform. The second set of scrubs followed. Smooth. Align the edges. Fold with intention. Each movement felt deliberate, ritualistic, like a funeral rite conducted in an empty basement. The steam from the dryers rose around her in white plumes, and she didn't stop it when tears finally came. No composure required now. No one to witness the crack in her armor. Just her and the machines and the faint sound of her own breathing, shallow and controlled despite the trembling in her chest. She folded the third set, taking longer with this one. Mercenary precision gave way to something else, something that looked like grief. When she placed her ID badge on top of the stack, Megan O'Brien, RN, license number for 82916, valid through June 2025, the credential felt like a tombstone she was placing on her own grave. Upstairs, Dr. Hayes was already in his office on the 4th floor, the administrator's corner suite with a panoramic view of Jacksonville's skyline. He hadn't slept. Couldn't sleep, not with the satisfaction of a clean surgical victory and the elimination of a threat. His computer screen glowed with a draft of his press statement for 9 a.m., maintaining clinical standards at Mercy General, a commitment to patient safety and professional integrity. Crafted language. Calculated words. He'd learned from 23 years in hospital politics that narrative was everything, shape the story before the story shapes you. His phone had been busy since 6 p.m. First call to Richard Sterling, board member and orthopedic surgeon, the one with the pharmaceutical distributor connections. "We have a problem," Hayes said, voice level as a scalpel. O'Brien accessed restricted medication logs. Could jeopardize the whole arrangement. Sterling had gasped, actual audible panic, before composing himself. "Handle it." Second call to Janet Marsh, his counterpart at Memorial Hospital across town, the one who'd recommended the ethics investigator. "I need someone fast," he told her. Former medical board chair, willing to work off the books. Someone who owes favors. She'd given him a name and a number before he even finished asking. The ethics investigator, Dr. Leonard Cross, 62 years old, retired from Johns Hopkins, carrying a reputation for demolishing problematic staff, arrived at Mercy General at 5 in the morning with a briefcase and a hunger for retainer fees that made Hayes smile. They met in an empty conference room. Hayes presented the evidence with the precision of a prosecutor: the unauthorized procedure, the clear violation of scope of practice, the patient code that occurred during her unauthorized intervention, the surgery that lasted longer because she'd contaminated the field. She performed a needle decompression, Hayes said, the words dripping with clinical disgust. Without physician authorization. Without proper sterile technique. She could have killed him. Cross wrote notes in a leather portfolio. Any documentation? Witness statements. 3 surgical nurses, the assisting resident, and I observed it personally, Hayes said. She used materials from the patient's personal effects, an MRE pouch, to fashion an improvised seal. Criminal negligence dressed up as battlefield medicine. By 7 a.m., the termination letter was drafted. By 7:45 a.m., HR had been briefed. By 8 a.m., Hayes had personally ensured that Megan's access codes were deactivated, her employee records flagged as separation due to gross violation of protocol, her references marked for contact by potential employers with a single, devastating notation, unauthorized practice outside scope of nursing license. He'd also made sure her nursing school was called. 3 separate conversations, each one planting a seed of doubt. We're concerned about the quality of training provided in your program. One of your graduates performed emergency surgical procedures without authorization. The implication hung in the air: your education standards are suspect, your graduates are risky, maybe you should review your curriculum. By the time Megan was folding her 3rd set of scrubs in the basement laundry, the investigation was already building its architecture of justification. Hayes had a report from Dr. Cross describing systematic scope creep and dangerous deviation from established protocols. He had statements from nurses he'd coached on the procedure's risks. He had a narrative that made her look like a rogue operator, a risk to patients, a liability to the hospital. What he didn't have was any idea who she actually was. In her apartment, the one she'd rented under her civilian identity in a quiet neighborhood off San Marco Avenue, Megan stood before her safe. The NCIS badge was inside, cold and official. The credentials that meant something beyond hospital politics. She stared at it for a long time without opening the door. Her phone buzzed at 2:58 a.m. Text message from her NCIS handler, Special Agent Richard Halloway, based out of Naval Station Mayport, cover blown. Extraction protocol initiated. Stand by for debrief. She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The pharmaceutical diversion ring was still intact, Hayes's operation, the supply chain director's distribution network, the 2 board members taking their cuts. She documented only 5 weeks' worth of evidence before Hayes had restricted her access. The field journal with the serial numbers, the pressed copies from Sanjin pressed between pages as a memory aid, all of it locked in her car, all of it insufficient. Mission failure tasted like copper and antiseptic. But in the ICU of Mercy General, 41 minutes after Megan placed her ID badge on the folded stack of scrubs, Sergeant Major Kenneth Reeves opened his eyes. The ventilator tube was gone from his throat. His color had returned, not the healthy pink of a man without trauma, but the alive and breathing pink of someone who'd been inches from the edge and pulled back. The chest decompression she performed with a 14-gauge angiocath and an improvised one-way valve fashioned from plastic film and medical tape had saved his life long enough for the surgical team to repair the underlying tension pneumothorax. A Marine Corps liaison sat in the chair beside his bed, Captain James Mitchell, uniformed in dress blues, assigned to monitor the senior enlisted casualty from the training accident at Camp Lejeune. Standard procedure. Nothing remarkable. The nurse, Reeves said, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper through the recovering larynx. The one who did the chest thing. The MRE wrapper. He coughed, waited through the pain of the movement. What was her name? Mitchell checked the incident report, the surgical notes, the nursing discharge papers. O'Brien. Megan O'Brien. She was terminated this evening, sir. Unauthorized procedure. Hospital policy violation. Reeves's eyes closed. His lips moved, a name forming silently at first, then audible, barely a breath, Valkyrie. Mitchell leaned forward. So. Her call sign was Valkyrie, Reeves said. Sanjin, 2019. She ran field trauma ops during the Taliban offensive. I read the citation 3 years ago. 43 patients treated under direct fire. She kept 15 of them alive with nothing but field expedient supplies and absolute refusal to quit. He opened his eyes, and they were the color of storm-dark water. You're going to get me a phone. Right now. And then you're going to call Colonel Vance at Leshan. By 3 o'clock in the morning, a full-bird colonel named Marcus Vance, commanding officer of 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, the unit Megan had served with in Helmand Province, was standing in his office at Camp Leshan, reading the incident report for Sergeant Major Reeves's training accident and the discharge summary for 1 Gunnery Sergeant Megan O'Brien, RN. By 3:15, he was making a phone call to the Pentagon. By 3:30, a Pentagon liaison was being roused from sleep to authorize emergency extraction protocols and coordinate with Naval Criminal Investigative Service Command. By 4 o'clock, 3 black SUVs were departing Camp Leshan, their tires humming against Route 17, and a Marine Corps CH-53 helicopter was receiving its pre-flight briefing. At 6:45 a.m., Megan's NCIS handler called her personal phone. "Don't go to work," Holloway said. "Don't go to the hospital. Stay in your apartment. Extraction protocol is live. Stand by." She was already at Mercy General. The basement laundry was empty when she left it. She'd walked out of that cold fluorescent cave and moved through the hospital corridors like a ghost, like someone already gone. The badge access codes were deactivated. She'd tried them, watched the doors stay sealed, accepted the rejection with the same composure she'd used to accept Hayes's insults. But she'd found a service entrance. She always found a way through. The ICU had drawn her like a compass needle finding north. She had to see Reeves breathing. Had to confirm that the improvised procedure, the desperate gamble, the violation of protocol had resulted in something other than catastrophic failure. She stood outside his room in the pre-dawn darkness, visible through the window, watching his chest rise and fall in the rhythm of recovery. That's where she was standing when the sound came, a sound like the ending of something, like the world opening up. A helicopter, heavy and unmistakable, rotors cutting through the morning air with the precision of a guillotine. The windows rattled. The sound was familiar in a way that made her nervous system recognize it before her conscious mind caught up. CH-53, Marine Corps transportation, the kind of bird that carries personnel, not supplies. The rotor wash shook the east wing of Mercy General like a hand gripping the building at its foundation. In the administration office, Dr. Hayes looked up from his press statement, confusion flickering across his face for the first time in 14 hours. In the CEO's office, alarms sounded as security reported an unauthorized helicopter landing in the emergency bay. By 8:20 a.m., Colonel Marcus Vance was striding through the lobby of Mercy General in dress blues, his uniform crisp enough to cut glass, his bearing the kind of quiet authority that made security personnel step aside without being asked. 3 black SUVs had disgorged 12 Marines in dress uniform. Another 4 were assembling at the hospital entrance, their presence turning the lobby into a military mobilization point. "Gunnery Sergeant O'Brien," Vance said to the desk attendant, his voice carrying across the space like a radio transmission. "Where is she?" 3 black SUVs cut through Jacksonville traffic like a blade through silk. Tires screamed at the Mercy General emergency entrance. The rotors of a Marine Corps UH-60M Black Hawk helicopter slowed to a thud above the parking lot, kicking up a storm of trash and scattered papers. It was 8:20 a.m. Dr. Hayes was in his office, reviewing talking points for a press conference about maintaining institutional standards. He had no idea what was about to walk through his hospital lobby. The full-bird colonel stepped out of the first SUV before it fully stopped. His dress blues were immaculate. His silver insignia caught the morning sun like a mirror. Behind him came 8 Marines in ceremonial uniforms, their movement synchronized like a single organism. They didn't walk into Mercy General. They claimed it. The lobby froze. A woman at the information desk dropped her pen. An orderly pushing a medication cart stopped mid-stride. Security looked confused, then terrified. The colonel approached the front desk, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding thousands of lives. "I'm looking for Gunnery Sergeant Megan O'Brien," he said. "Call sign Valkyrie." "Where is she?" The desk attendant tried to speak. No words came out. A second Marine stepped forward with a tablet, scrolling through something official. The colonel's jaw was carved from granite. His eyes moved across the lobby with the calculated patience of a predator. Not angry. Worse. Methodical. 5 floors above, in ICU room for 12, Sergeant Major Kenneth Reeves woke to the sound of helicopter rotors fading. His chest was wrapped in gauze. His 4 lines were taped down with precision. A Navy corpsman stood beside his bed. Reeves's eyes focused on the ceiling, then on the window where the Black Hawk was landing. His lips moved barely a whisper. "Valkyrie." The corpsman leaned down. "Sergeant Major." "That's the call sign," Reeves said, each word careful, measured. He'd served with her in Sanjin. He'd watched her maintain a field hospital, just her, one other medic, and 43 Marines, for 16 hours under sustained Taliban assault. The walls around them had shaken from incoming fire. The floor had been blood. She'd stayed. She'd given orders like she was made of steel. When the extraction helicopters finally arrived, she was still standing, still operating, still saving lives. Reeves had forgotten nothing. Neither had his unit. Within minutes, the Marines were moving through the hospital corridors. Doctors stepped aside. Nurses stared. The elevator opened on the 5th floor, and the colonel walked out like he owned the place. Behind him came a lieutenant carrying a folder. The colonel entered ICU room for 12 without stopping at the desk. Reeves's face didn't move, but his eyes cleared. He saw the colonel. Recognition flooded his features. "Sergeant Major," the colonel said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a declaration of status. "We need to know what happened. All of it." Reeves took a breath that cost him visible pain. His hand moved to the bandages across his chest. "Improvised chest seal," he said. "Field expedient decompression." Needle entered the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She used an MRE pouch wrapper and medical tape. "I was coding from a tension pneumothorax. Blood pressure was unsustainable." He paused. His eyes held something like awe. 14-gauge needle. Perfect angle. Perfect pressure. "She saved my life." The lieutenant opened the folder. His voice came out clear and formal, each word weighted with ceremony. "By order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Gunnery Sergeant Megan O'Brien is hereby recognized for conspicuous gallantry under fire in Sanjin, Helmand Province, where she maintained a field hospital under sustained Taliban assault for 16 consecutive hours, performing emergency surgical procedures while under direct fire, preserving the lives of 27 Marines under impossible conditions, and demonstrating the kind of courage and medical expertise that exemplifies the finest traditions of the United States Marine Corps." The words hung in the room like incense. Reeves's jaw clenched. A tear tracked down his scarred cheek, but he didn't blink. The lieutenant read the citation completely, every formal line, every medal, every commendation. It was Megan's Silver Star, read aloud in a hospital room 500 miles from where she'd earned it. The moment shattered. Dr. Hayes burst through the ICU doors like a man possessed. His face was flushed. His hair was disheveled. Everything about him screamed panic wrapped in false authority. "This is highly irregular," he spat at the colonel. "These individuals have no authorization to be in this facility. That woman, Megan O'Brien, is no longer an employee of this hospital. She was terminated for gross violation of protocol and performing procedures outside her scope of practice. I don't care what kind of military personnel she claims to be. She is a security risk and a liability." The colonel didn't look at him. He didn't acknowledge Hayes existed. That silence was more powerful than any rebuke. The elevator doors opened behind Hayes. A 2-star general stepped out in dress blues that seemed to glow. Behind him came a Pentagon liaison with a leather briefcase. The general moved past Hayes without comment. In the ICU room, the general stood beside Reeves's bed and saluted him with the respect reserved for heroes. "Sergeant Major," the general said. "Your sacrifice has been acknowledged." Then he turned to face the doorway, face to face with Dr. Hayes for the first time. Hayes stepped backward instinctively. "Where is Gunnery Sergeant O'Brien?" the general asked. Hayes's mouth opened and closed like a broken hinge. She's been terminated. Personnel decision. Documentation filed. I have cause." "I'm not interested in your documentation," the general said. His voice was like distant thunder. "I'm interested in her location." The Pentagon liaison stepped forward. He opened the briefcase. Inside was a stack of credentials, official seals, and a sheaf of documents. He handed them to the colonel without a word. The colonel opened them, read the first page, and looked at Hayes with something approaching pity. "Dr. Hayes," the colonel said. "Megan O'Brien isn't a nurse." "Not entirely. She's Special Agent Megan O'Brien, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, operating under deep cover to investigate pharmaceutical diversion from military hospitals. The field journal in your hospital records, the one with the pressed desert flowers from Sanjin, that's federal evidence. Every medication serial number documented in her handwriting. Every shipment discrepancy cross-referenced. Every one of your diversions tracked and recorded." Hayes's face went the color of old bone. "You fired a federal agent," the general said. "In the middle of an active multi-state investigation. That's a felony." 30 seconds of silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. The liaison held up a second folder. "These are her NCIS credentials and federal authority. Effective immediately, she has full investigative jurisdiction. She's not a disgraced nurse. She never was. You were standing next to a legend the entire time you mocked her." The moment fractured like glass. At 10 a.m., Dr. Hayes held a press conference. Not the one he'd planned about maintaining standards. This one was desperate, defensive, a man drowning and gasping for air. Local news channel WJX carried it live. Jacksonville's morning audience watched as Hayes stood behind a microphone in the hospital's public relations office, his tie askew, his hands shaking. "I stand by my decision to terminate Megan O'Brien," he said to the cameras. "She violated multiple protocols. Performed unauthorized procedures. Fabricated credentials. I don't care what medal she claims." The news anchor interrupted. Her earpiece crackled. Her eyes widened. "Dr. Hayes, we have a call from Washington. The Secretary of the Navy is on the line." The broadcast split. Secretary of the Navy Raymond Chen appeared via video call, his presence transmitted to 3 million Jacksonville viewers. He held up a leather-bound book. The Field Journal. Megan's Field Journal, filled with pressed desert flowers and documentation so meticulous that every page was a confession, his confession, written in her handwriting, each entry a stone in the foundation of his destruction. "Dr. Hayes," Chen said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "I'm looking at Gunnery Sergeant O'Brien's documentation of your pharmaceutical theft ring. $60,000 in diverted fentanyl. Connected to you, Supply Chain Director Morrison, and board members Kellerman and Price." The secretary opened the journal on camera. Pages of careful notation. Medication serial numbers. Shipment timestamps. Cross-references that connected every theft, every diversion, every lie. 20 years of Hayes's corruption, exposed in the careful handwriting of a woman he'd called community college trained. The press conference erupted. FBI agents entered the hospital. Torres had called them the moment Hayes went live. Arrest warrants already signed. Charges already filed. Hayes tried to speak, but his microphone cut to static. Federal marshals were already approaching. The moment he tried to run, his career ended. 48 hours later, the investigation was complete. 72 hours after that, Hayes's medical license was suspended pending revocation. Board members Kellerman and Price resigned before the warrants were issued. Supply chain director Morrison was arrested in Atlanta trying to flee. The pharmaceutical diversion ring didn't collapse. It evaporated. It ceased to exist. The only thing left was evidence, all of it documented by Megan, all of it usable in court, all of it pointing directly at the man who'd tried to destroy her. 3 weeks passed. The night security shift at Mercy General began at 10 p.m. The badge said Hayes. No doctor anymore. The title was gone, revoked by the medical board, erased from the system. He walked the corridors in a dark uniform that fit like a coffin. His job was to patrol, to check locks, to maintain order in a hospital where everyone knew what he'd done. The Gunnery Sergeant Megan O'Brien Memorial Trauma Wing opened for patient care on a Tuesday morning. The dedication ceremony happened at 11 a.m. 300 people attended. Megan stood in dress blues, her silver star and Navy Cross on her chest. Beside her stood Sergeant Major Reeves, recovered completely, his presence a monument to what one person could accomplish under fire. Behind them stood General Kowalski and the full bird colonel, both saluting. The display case was unveiled. Inside, her silver star. Her field journal, open to a page with a pressed desert poppy. And the MRE wrapper, the improvised chest seal, preserved behind museum glass like a holy relic. The plaque read, "Improvise, adapt, overcome." That night, Hayes walked past the display case at 11:47 p.m. His reflection was ghostly in the glass. The silver star gleamed under museum lighting. The MRE wrapper sat preserved like evidence of his defeat. Every night of his shift, he would walk past it. Every night, he would see her legacy. Every night, he would be reminded that she'd won. By day, visitors filed past the case, honoring the woman he'd called unqualified. By night, Hayes walked his rounds in silence, a man defined by the one moment he met someone braver than himself and lost. Megan was at the VA hospital in her new position, working with combat veterans, using every skill she'd earned in Sanjin. Her scrubs didn't have medals, but they didn't need them. She was exactly where she was meant to be, in the hands of people whose lives had been broken, showing them that wounds could heal if you had someone steady enough to hold you together. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.